They took the Ohio River. Travel stories, songs, and scenes with Sunny Jane Morton. The history of the Ohio River is as long and changing as its winding shorelines. Before European conquest, the river was a local road, a source of water and food, a boundary marker between neighboring communities. The Iroquois named it Oyo, or the Great River. The mighty Ohio begins in what is now Pittsburgh, where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers come together, and flows south and west for nearly 1,000 meandering miles until it empties into the even mightier Mississippi River. To French conquerors, merchants and settlers coming down from the north, the Ohio River was a southern border of a vast, beautiful land where they, with or without the acquiescence of those who already lived there, built forts and harvested millions of dollars of furs and other natural resources. Many would have used a canoe, something like this rare surviving example from about 1800. It was hand-hewn from the forest using simple tools and back-breaking labor. South of the river were the British conquerors and settlers, kept from crossing by a 1763 proclamation. But would-be settlers, including a young George Washington, cast a covetous eye across the Ohio River to the fertile, rich lands beyond. Nearly 25 years later, in 1787, the young U.S. government issued the Northwest Ordinance, sanctioning occupation by U.S. residents of lands northwest of the Ohio River, part or all of what are now the states Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. The Ohio River became a watery highway to conquest and opportunity. Road conditions, so to speak, were primitive. The late 1700s and early 1800s were a time before enterprising businessmen or the Army Corps of Engineers would have tamed the river with locks, dams, or dredges. This was a time when river levels rose and fell rapidly, entirely at the mercy of local runoff, and ice dams could form quickly. When the shape of the river, its bends, its eddies, its danger spots, changed continually. Yet the river nonetheless filled with locals, migrants, and freight haulers in flatboats and keelboats. The migrants especially were often completely untrained, no driver's license, so to speak, and their vulnerable cargo was often their family, their children, and all their worldly possessions. The men were literally and figuratively at the wheel of these journeys. What spurred them on? This popular song from the era captures some of the motivations driving them. Come all ye brisk young fellows who have a mind to roam, all in some foreign country a long way from home, all in some foreign country along with me to go. And we'll settle on the banks of the lovely Ohio, we'll settle on the banks of the lovely Ohio. Come all you pretty fair maids, spin us some yarn, to make us some nice clothing to keep ourselves warm. For you can knit and sew, my loves, while we do reap and mow. When we settle on the banks of the lovely Ohio, when we settle on the banks of the lovely Ohio. There are fishes in the river, just fitted for our use. There's tall and lofty sugar cane that will give to us its juice. There's every kind of game, my boys, also the buck and doe. When we settle on the banks of the lovely Ohio, when we settle on the banks of the lovely Ohio. The first Ohio River travel guide was published in 1801, The Navigator by Zadok Kramer. The first two editions sold out quickly and none survive today. A third edition in 1802 added the Monongahela, Allegheny, and Mississippi rivers. In one form or another, additional versions of the Navigator, also called the Pilot, Emigrant's Guide, New River Guide, etc., appeared for more than 50 years following. They filled the pockets of every savvy traveler. Each edition built on or outright stole the content from the previous one, sometimes with new tips for different modes of travel or updated descriptions of the river channel or towns. The Navigator was also a siren song to the restless or curious. An early edition called the Ohio River the most beautiful river in the universe, whether we consider it for its meandering course through an immense region of forests, for its clean and elegant banks, which afford innumerable delightful situations for cities, villages, and improved farms, or for those many other advantages which truly entitle it to the name originally given it by the French, La Belle Rivière. More than 10 years before the Navigator first published, New Jersey native Samuel Foreman traveled down the Ohio River with a party of nearly 100 people, the extended Foreman family, their friends, and about 60 additional men, women, and children the Foremans enslaved. They traveled in the winter of 1789 and 90, and they didn't have any idea what they were doing. They could have desperately used a guide like the Navigator, as they lived a journey almost Odyssean, with plenty of missteps, mishaps, and near misses, delays and encounters with locals who were alternately hospitable or hostile. In late 1789, the Foreman party traveled overland about a 3-week trip from New Jersey to Pittsburgh. There they had to wait about a month until the river rose sufficiently. They also needed to equip themselves for the river journey. Let's turn, as they couldn't yet, to the Navigator for the advice they could have used. The first thing to be attended to by emigrants or traders wanting to descend the river is to procure a boat, to be ready so as to take advantage of the times of floods, and to be careful that the boat be a good one, for many of the accidents that happen in navigating the Ohio and Mississippi are owing to the unpardonable carelessness or penuriousness of the boat builder, who will frequently slight his work. Flat-bottomed boats for the Ohio and Mississippi navigation may be procured almost anywhere along the Monongahela River. Samuel's party bought a flatboat at Pittsburgh to haul their tobacco cargo and serve as home for the enslaved men. These boats were flat-bottomed and boarded over the top and appeared like floating houses, Samuel later recalled. It could have been something like this one at the Ohio River Museum in Marietta. Samuel's party also used a 70-foot keel boat. He described it as decked over with a cabin for lodging purposes, but too low to stand up erect. The beds and bedding lay on the floor, and the insides lined with plank to prevent the Indians from penetrating through with their balls should they attack us. The keelboat quarters were deemed comfortable for the family and their friends. Samuel recalled both boats were armed with rifles, pistols, etc., it being in Indian war time. All boats descending that long river were liable to be attacked every hour by a merciless foe, oftentimes led on by renegade whites. This is a rare 1840s photograph of a keelboat on the water. The Foreman party embarked on a day in late January, when the river was high, the current rapid. This sounds so dangerous today. Late January? Was this really the best time for travel? The Navigator would weigh in several years later. The best seasons for navigating the Ohio, it says, are in the spring and autumn. The spring season commences at the breaking up of the ice, which generally happens about the middle of February and continues good for about 3 months. The fall season generally commences in October and continues until about the 1st of December, when the ice frequently begins to form, but the seasons of high water vary considerably. Descending the river when much incommoded with floating ice should be avoided as much as possible. However, if the water is high and there is an appearance of open weather, you may venture with some propriety if the cakes of ice are not so heavy so as to impede your progress or injure your timbers. The boat will in such case make more way than the ice, a great deal of which will sink and get thinner as it progresses. High water was a good thing for the Foremans. The going was faster and more efficient. Apart from ice, you were less likely to encounter hostilities or run out of provisions because you were moving faster. High water meant you'd ride over the top of the many, many hidden dangers in the river, like sunken trees, sandbars, rapids, and even the wrecks of other boats that were not quite so fortunate. As they launched their journey, said Samuel, our keel boat took the lead. These boats are guided by oars, seldom used except the steering oar or when passing islands, as the current goes about 6 or 7 miles an hour. As the waters were now high, the current was perhaps 8 or 9 miles an hour. According to the navigator, the foreman party was right not to use the oars. It was best to let the current naturally carry you into deeper channels at the fastest possible pace. Trying to steer yourself out of the current was likely to get yourself mired along a riverbank in the shallows, among slow-moving waters filled with debris. During their very first night, they had a serious rookie mishap. They dropped anchor as it got dark along the riverbank. Samuel recalled, as soon as the anchor fastened itself in the river bottom, the boat gave a little lurch, the cable tore away all the framework around the deck. Several little black children were on deck at the time, and as it had now become quite dark, it could not be ascertained in the excitement of the moment whether any of them had been thrown into the water. Fortunately, none were missing. Now they didn't feel safe to stop and sleep. Instead, one man piloted the boat through the dark night, calling out to Samuel and another man who was helping him steer when they needed to change direction. It was heavy work all night. He recalled, ours was a perilous situation till we landed at Wheeling, 96 miles downriver from Pittsburgh. It was the most distressing night I ever experienced. They got a steering oar when they stopped, which helped things considerably. Night travel, though, on its own, wasn't a bad thing, says the navigator. As frequent landing is attended with considerable loss of time and some hazard, you should contrive to land as seldom as possible. You need not even lie by at night, provided you trust to the current and keep a good lookout. If you have a moon, so much the better. I'm not sure the exhausted Samuel would have agreed that first night. Samuel mentioned their omnipresent fear of violent altercations with Native Americans who were defending their lands. This fear kept the migrants from venturing onto land for food, even though wild game was often spotted from the river. They stopped at Fort Washington, which was still an active military post, and which he credited with providing security for the travelers and the few families that lived nearby. At the Falls of the Ohio at Louisville, Kentucky, the river dropped about 22.5 feet over 2 miles, according to the navigator, in a series of rapids that shot around both sides of a small island and lots of other obstacles. Boaters needed an experienced guide to steer them over the falls. Lacking guides, they had to hug the riverbanks or shoot the most apparently navigable rapids on their own and hope for the best. Some people unloaded their boats to lighten them and carried all their goods along a 2-mile portage. During the times of lowest water, you'd have to portage the boats too. As of 1802, a pilot for the safe conducting of boats through the falls has been regularly appointed by the court, who is answerable for all damages sustained through his neglect or bad management. The prices for pilotage of boats of all sizes are regulated by the court. Many of the chutes were too narrow for flat boats, like that used by Samuel's group. Here's a shot of the Falls of the Ohio many years later, when the river has been much tamed, but showing those treacherous rocks at low water. The following is taken from a commentary prepared for visitors to the Falls of the Ohio, taken from accounts curated by the Filson Historical Society. George Gretzinger, one of the early falls pilots, reported the space between the rocks of Indian Chute was initially only 11 feet and 8 inches wide. This clearance was adequate for narrow canoes and small boats, but not for flatboats, often 15 feet or more abeam. The early falls pilots therefore carried sledgehammers along during their passages through the chute to knock off the projecting points of rock, and in this primitive fashion they gradually widened the space between the rocks to 18 feet. Still, Gretzinger reported, many flatboats with their cargoes have been injured or lost coming in contact with rocks. Continuing from that account, around 1806, a boat owner declared that from 8 to 12 boats were wrecked and lost every year while crossing the falls. It appeared that about 1% of the boats crossing the falls before 1811 were totally wrecked, while a larger percentage suffered significant damages. The exact number can never be known because no records of the wrecks were kept. Indeed, most were not mentioned in local newspapers until the 1840s, when newspapers began employing river reporters. As late as 1874, after some improvements to the falls chutes had been completed, insurance agents still added a 1% surcharge for any boat attempting to shoot the falls after dark. So how did things go for Samuel at the falls? A dead stop. He reported, "The weather now grew so severely cold in late January that the river became blocked with ice. The whole travel party just had to stop at Louisville, where the falls were, rent a house, and open a storefront to sell their extra provisions in this Kentucky town of about 60 houses, 1 tavern, and 1 boarding house, which was kept by the local doctor who was also the river pilot to get people over the falls." A full month later, the river became ice-free, and Samuel's travel party continued. But Samuel himself stayed in Louisville to finish selling off their extra goods. He enjoyed the locals' hospitality, dances, and playing billiards with the women, who he said were more fun and less prone to gamble than the men, though he recalled being taken to task for closing his store on Sunday. "Sunday had not crossed the mountains with them," said Samuel. "I had the honor of being the first to observe the day in Louisville." Eventually, Samuel traded off his store inventory to a man in exchange for a new tobacco boat, which they loaded below the falls. He set off with a party of other tobacco boats. They narrowly avoided hostilities with Native Americans, but did get stuck on what the river people called a planter, a tree embedded in the river bottom. Samuel mentioned another kind of tree hazard too, a sawyer, a tree that falls into the river and bobs up and down wildly, dangerously, sawing up and down, hence the word sawyer. And then, finally, their trip down the Ohio River came to an end as that river flowed into the mighty Mississippi River. Samuel later wrote, "When we arrived at the mouth of the Ohio, we stopped. I fastened my boat to trees, and the other boats did likewise. We kept watch with an axe in hand to cut the fastenings in case of a surprise by Indians. Here were marks of buffalo having rested. Where the waters of the Mississippi and Ohio mingle, they look like putting dirty soap suds and pure water together. So we filled all our vessels that were watertight, for fear we might suffer for want of good water on our voyage. But we found out afterward that the Mississippi was very good water when filtered." The journey in 1789 seems to have taken Samuel in total maybe 3 months, with all the delays and having to stop and keep store in Louisville. 10 years later, the navigator said that a non-stop passage should take about 15 days, but most travelers probably didn't experience a non-stop journey. Back to this image of that canoe from about 1800. My own ancestors traveled from New England through New York to the Allegheny and down the Ohio River to Marietta in the fall of 1801. According to an account written many years later by someone who was a child on that journey, Father and the Pond brothers, one of whom was my ancestor, made 2 large canoes which carried our 2 wagons, the goods, and the 3 families. Mr. Howe and Esquire Prouty built 4 canoes which carried their wagons, families, and all their goods. Our canoes were run single till we reached the Allegheny River, then they were lashed together 2 and 2 and 2, just far enough apart to let the end of the hub rest on the edge of the canoe. When we started down the Allegheny, the water was very low, and there was no one of our company that had any experience with boating, and we were put to a great deal of trouble to get our boats over the riffles." The account continues, and I'll skip ahead to an interesting bit. "We landed and built a fire and prepared our dinner. After dinner, we boarded our boats and started out. Father remarked that we were too close together, and if we should get in a riffle, we would have trouble. No sooner said than done. Our canoes grounded, and the end of Uncle Peter's ran in between ours and separated them, and left most of our goods, women and children, in the river. The water was from 2 to 3 feet deep, but very fortunately we were all gathered up safely, the most of them on the point of an island a short distance below, while the balance made the main above. No evil resulted from this mishap, save a good ducking and what time it took to gather up our goods. There were 6 children under 4 years old. Every old lady caught a child as they were floating. My sister Jerusha was the only one that came near being drowned. Over time, it became easier, safer, and faster to travel the Ohio River. The first steamship chugged down the river in 1811, and within several years, riverboats were running back up the river too. But even after the advent of steamboats, many migrants continued to travel in smaller, unproven watercraft, without any more training than perhaps a tattered copy of the Navigator. Another of my ancestors migrated from Ohio in 1859, more than half a century later, down the river by boat to the Mississippi, then up to the Missouri River to Jefferson City, Missouri. The entire family came, mom, dad, kids, and an elderly great-aunt, and years later, family memory still listed what they brought with them. Several possessions, furniture, household goods, blankets, coverlets, and kettles. As I close this narrative, I would love to share the story of Thomas Selby, whose family migrated down the Ohio River in 1859 in the form of this song, the Ballad of Thomas Selby, sung to a tune you might recognize. Just sit right back and you'll hear a tale of adventurous frontier life of a man named Thomas Selby and Huldah, his dear wife. He was born a twin and they both survived, but their mom gave them away. Their aunt raised them in Ohio. Who knows where all they strayed? Tom bought land, got married there, had kids and practiced law, went off to join the gold rushers, which stuck in Huldah's craw. Came back and he said, guess what, my dear, I bought us some new land. Let's pull up stakes and move out west. I hear the scenery's grand. I hope mosquitoes don't bother you or Ohio River travel. I plan to start a general store and earn my wig and gavel. His clan hit ground in the Ozarks of Missouri's green frontier, with Huldah dear, his aged aunt. 3 fine sons, including LeGrand. LeGrand's hot wife, Rebecca Neal, joined them there on the Missouri frontier. His tale's not over yet, my friends. He did start up that store, was a prosperous judge and attorney too, so says the family lore. Then 3 sons died, 1 a baby, 1 in the Civil War. A sympathy card arrived from the mom who gave him up years before. LeGrand and his hot wife also died, leaving a little girl. Tom and Huldah raised dear Edna, to them she meant the world. He spent retirement buying land and prosecuting crooks. When he died he was pretty rich, so say the county books. As a widow Huldah got her due, she and Edna did just fine. She hired a man to run the farm. He fell in love with Edna dear. They married then, guess what they did? They had 10 kids, hooray for Edna dear. I actually don't know whether Thomas and Huldah traveled on a flatboat or a steamboat or something else. By then, in 1859, all of these were options. The river was busy with traffic, migrants, travelers, and freighters. La Belle Rivière, the beautiful river, had become a highway into the heartland of a young and growing nation.